Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. That's a little bit more of a glitzy intro than we usually have at Town Hall, and I love it. My name is Edward Wolcher. I'm the Curator of Community Programs here at Town Hall Seattle, and this is such a fantastic honor for me to welcome you to this evening's program for the 150th anniversary of The Nation magazine, presented by, There's going to be a lot of Nation applause lines tonight, so we want to make sure we have time for a real program. This program tonight is presented by The Nation magazine in partnership with Town Hall Seattle as part of Town Hall's Civic Series, a series supported by the Boeing Company, the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, with media sponsorship provided by The Stranger and KUOW. So a couple quick announcements. The feature film that we just saw a clip of is playing tomorrow night at the Seattle Public Library. Hot Type is the title of that film. That screening is at 7 p.m. downtown, and it's free. There is a bookstore table set up in the lobby tonight. Our friends at the University Bookstore were good enough to bring selections of a number of the authors who you'll see on stage tonight, so make sure you go ahead and browse down there. Tonight's program is more of a magazine on stage format, so we will be doing a few things differently than a standard town hall talk. We're not doing audience Q&A to fit in all of the program we have tonight, and there won't be a book signing afterwards, but please do stick around. Our bar and cafe will be open in the lobby. We'd love for you to schmooze, meet some of the folks from the Nation who are here, and get to know one another who you came with. I think many of you in the audience are people who care about The Nation magazine and the fabulous roster of guests they've put together for us tonight. So I'm assuming you're probably also familiar with Town Hall. Nation writers and contributors have been a core element of Town Hall's civic program over the years. We present lectures from authors, activists, and thinkers, and our calendar often reads like the table of contents for the next upcoming issue of The Nation magazine, and vice versa. So we jumped at this opportunity to partner with them and host this fantastic program. Some highlights in Town Hall's recent Nation past include, of course, last year's lecture Sold Out in This Room by Naomi Klein, who's here tonight, talking about her book, This Changes Everything. That talk was just a few weeks after the People's Climate Summit in New York City, and I'm honored to say that we're just having this event here just the day after the People's Climate March here in Seattle. So thank you to the activists in the room who did that. I think the intellectual energy that built around that event that night here at Town Hall helped bring together a lot of folks in the climate justice movement and helped build some of the energy that led to the Shall No campaign here in the spring and climate justice activism. So that was another great confluence of the Nation and Town Hall. Other Nation events in the past year included a phenomenal presentation from the Nation's Katha Pollitt, author of Pro, who spoke here just a few months before her powerful Nation cover story, which so transformed the politics of the abortion movement in this year, 2015, and the Shout Your Abortion movement. Just some great intersections have been the case here. In the near future, just next month, Town Hall will be presenting Nation writer Ari Berman, talking about his book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Yeah. He will be speaking here on November 6th, just a few days after Seattle's own highly consequential local election. So make sure you vote on November 3rd or by mail beforehand, which is our way, and come check out that talk from Ari a few days before. If this is your first time at Town Hall, if these Nation writers in the past haven't brought you here, and this is the program that's brought you here for the first time, I can't imagine there's too many of you, but I hope we'll get you interested in our program here. A couple other highlights in the near future include a presentation on October 21st with Roberta Kaplan, the lawyer who successfully argued the DOMA case before the Supreme Court, and a program the following Thursday with eminent MIT sociologist Sherry Turkle on reclaiming conversation in the digital age. Add to that the full range of literary, music, and science programs, and you get a picture of what we do here. Finally, I will say that this is a member-supported organization, so thank you to our members in the audience. I know there's probably a lot of overlap between Nation subscribers and Town Hall members in this city. And one last Town Hall announcement is we are in the beginning stages of a major renovation campaign for this building. This beautiful room that has hosted so many of the people you'll see on stage tonight will stay pretty much the same in terms of its homey feel, but we're going to do some big under the hood improvements for the building, some seismic retrofits to prevent us from collapsing in that big earthquake we're all now worried about in Seattle. And we'd love to get some interest and some buzz going about this renovation campaign. We have a website that's just debuted about it. It is lovethistown.org, and you can find links to that and links to all of our upcoming programs, as well as information about membership here on our main website, which is townhallseattle.org. Okay, now to tonight's program. The Nation magazine was founded by abolitionists 4 months after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. As the oldest weekly news magazine in the United States, it has been a reliable home for provocative and thoughtful reporting on politics, culture, and the arts. To mark the 150th anniversary of the magazine this year, the Nation is touring the country. This visit to Seattle is part of that tour. The Nation has survived these 150 years in part because it's scrappy, unafraid to speak the truth, and has continued to both chronicle and champion core issues like racial justice, economic equality, free speech, and human rights over the pursuit of profit or political access. I'd like to add one personal note here. My family growing up took the Nation magazine, and it shows the kind of nerd I am maybe, or certainly what led me to this line of work, that the Nation subscription was one of the first gifts I asked for after leaving home. As somebody who came of age during the unsettling political realities of the first part of this century, starting with the Battle of Seattle here in Seattle, which profoundly shaped me, to the wars of the Bush administration, to the Great Recession, the Nation was critical in stabilizing and defining my own personal political and social consciousness. This program tonight that they've put together includes some of the local political figures who have been most inspiring to me, as well as some writers and thinkers internationally who have most defined how I think about the world and how I think a lot of us in the room who are fans of Town Hall and the program we do here think about the world. So it's a great testament to the creativity of the magazine, what they've put together tonight, and a tremendous personal honor to have a chance to introduce this. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Katrina Vanden, Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation. Her vision and dedication are largely responsible for the Nation's enduring success. She's a winner of 1 million awards. You can come on up, Katrina. I don't need to list all of her fantastic awards. I will say she's been at The Nation for 20 years as editor and publisher. Before that, she started as an intern, which is a testament of hope for the beleaguered intern class in the audience. So please give one more round of applause for Katrina Vanden.
You can tell how excited I am. We are to be in Seattle. I wanted to get up here right away. Edward, you now have a lifetime subscription to The Nation. Thank you for coming out tonight. The Nation loves Seattle. We love Seattle because we know that this city has long believed that another world is possible. The battle for Seattle in 1999 was a defining moment for the Nation. My colleague John Nichols was here along with a team of Nation correspondents. Naomi Klein's No Logo framed that extraordinary moment. And I think you can see the arc, the continuum, as you look out across the world today. Thousands of people in the streets, countries fighting austerity politics, discredited status quo politics, and we see it in our own country coming back. And Seattle was central to that. It is extraordinary to be with some of the people from the city you're going to hear from tonight. Kshama Sawant, Pramila Jayapal, Nick Licata. They give us inspiration in New York, and they give inspiration to progressives, to humanists around this country. You are in for a treat, a celebration, an evening of inspiration and celebration. And I now want to bring up here who will help guide us tonight, will MC, is truly extraordinary, critical part of the Nation, National Affairs correspondent John Nichols. If you don't know him, you're going to meet him. You're not going to want to say goodbye to him. He is a contributor, longtime contributor to The Nation, to many other publications. He's the architect of the media and democracy movement. And let me just quote from former Nation contributing editor, the great late Gore Vidal, what he said about John. Of all the giant slayers now afoot in the great American desert, John Nichols' sword is the sharpest. Before I turn it over to the great slayer, John Nichols, let me just say that all of the speakers and performers here tonight would like to gratefully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territorial of the Coast Salish peoples. And with that, John Nichols.
Katrina Vanden, Heuvel. Seattle is an incredibly cool town. And what I like about the people of Seattle is that they're well aware of that. So when you say it's a cool town, everybody's like, yeah. That's good because you aspire there. And I just want to begin by saying that your coolness kind of put us off a little. I'm sorry, that many of us come from rural places and we weren't sure we were ready. And that's why we waited 150 years to bring this event to Seattle, Washington, because we feel we are ready to stand with you. And I saw it today. I'm up there on Pike Street in 10th. I'm walking around. I saw the Comet Tavern. And I thought to myself, this is it. Finally, the Nation magazine in alcoholic form. Not kidding. No. I mean, some of my comrades for the Nation have not been there yet. But on the front of the Comet Tavern in huge, very nicely printed lettering, it says, "No sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, or general hatefulness allowed." We won. No, I'm serious. I come from Wisconsin. When the bars say that, that is very good. And then, framing it was the clenched fist of solidarity of the trade union movement and social democracy. And I was reminded that Seattle is a union town. Seattle is a union town. I was here in 1999, and I remember the incredible excitement when we were down in, I think it was at one of your stadiums, built by one of your billionaires. If you built it, the billionaire just got the tax break or whatever. Yeah, I know. It's like, the town is sick with billionaires. But, so anyways, I'm down there, and I think it was Trumpka, got up and he said, no, I'm sorry, it was the head of the Longshore Union. The head of the Longshore Union got up and said, "We have just shut the ports from Vancouver to San Diego." And I thought to myself, this is so cool. Trade unionism actually making something happen, or in this case, not happen. And the thing we made not happen in 1999 in Seattle was an overwhelming wave of globalization on behalf of multinational corporations that sought to take away everything that we cared about. And people in this town stood up so strong, so well. It didn't stop them all, didn't stop everything, but it sent a message out from this town, from Seattle, that they would not pass without a fight. And brothers and sisters, we've been fighting them now for 15 years, 16 years. And each step of the way, we have gotten stronger. The trade union movement has changed. We cover it at the Nation magazine more now than we have for decades because there's something vital and something real happening. The Nation is 150 years old, but we keep getting reminded of what actually matters on the streets in places across this country and around the world. We have to be in touch with it because the Nation magazine doesn't know how to make money. We got to be with the people. Now, I'm serious. This is a competence issue, and I understand, but this is really true. I got in trouble the other night because I said that in the entire 150 years, the Nation magazine had only made a profit in one quarter. Not 1/4 of 150 years, 1/4 of 1 year. And I was corrected. Katrina, Vanden, who immediately ran to me and said, no, you've got it way wrong. It was several quarters. But the truth of the matter is the Nation has never, ever been some big profitable journal. The Nation magazine has always wasted its money, wasted its resources, going out finding Canadians like Naomi Klein, giving them work in America. Naomi Klein is with us tonight. That is very cool, isn't it? Doing crazy things like hiring a sportswriter, trying to say that there's something political about sports. Dave Zirin is with us tonight. Doing all these incredible things, but also covering the grassroots politics of communities across this country. And to do that, you don't make a big fortune. It's not big money in it. Sometimes you're a little bit ahead of the curve, writing about something that people have to catch up with. Sometimes you have to read another magazine. You got to say, well, who's a little ahead of us? So we always pick up our copy of Yes Magazine from right here in Seattle. We got the folks from Yes Magazine right here all together. And we got our comrades all over. And we love us some Seattle Education Association teachers. Our friend Jesse Hagopian is here tonight. Jesse was just out on strike with the teachers, but it was such a nation strike. Because when Jesse and those teachers went out on strike, they didn't just go out on strike for their own pay or their own benefits. They went on strike to challenge this over-the-top crazy testing. They went on strike to challenge overcrowded classrooms. They went on strike to challenge the neglect of children by a system that always has money for a war, but never has money for public education. Brothers and sisters, I think they took a little bit of that Occupy message and brought it into the public education fight. And, in New York City, when the Occupy movement broke out, one of our editors at The Nation magazine, editors are supposed to sit at their computer and not look up. They wear those little green visors. One of our editors at The Nation magazine, he just couldn't resist. He had to go out there and cover the hell out of it. Because we don't have editors that just sit there. We have editors that get into the thick of it because they love the story and they love the struggle. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored tonight to introduce to you as the first of a number of speakers who will do both readings from classic Nation articles, but also some comments of their own. I'm honored to introduce to you the person who edits our web pages and has brought the Nation into the 21st century in so many ways, but has never, ever forgotten the 150-year core mission of this journal of peace and economic and social justice. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Kim.
Thank you, Seattle. I'm going to be reading from an essay written by the great American writer Tony Kushner. It's called Socialism of the Skin, and it was first published in The Nation on July 4th, 1994. And I read this essay as a college student for the first time, and it was probably the reason I applied for an internship at The Nation magazine. And many years later, I dug up that internship folder. And I saw the sort of notes on it, and it had said, wait list. So I guess some people turned down that internship, and that's how I ended up at The Nation all these years. But seriously, I make an effort to go back and read this Tony Kushner essay every few years because it poses a set of questions to me that I have not done answering. It's a very challenging text. And I think it's a really rich one to this day. Is there a relationship between homosexual liberation and socialism? That is an unfashionably utopian question, but I pose it because it's entirely conceivable that we will one day live miserably in a thoroughly ravaged world in which lesbians and gay men can marry and serve openly in the military, and that's it. Capitalism, after all, can absorb a lot. Poverty, war, alienation, environmental destruction, colonialism, unequal development, boom-bust cycles, private property, individualism, commodity fetishism, the fetishization of the body, the fetishization of violence, guns, drugs, child abuse, underfunded and bad education, itself a form of child abuse. These things are key to the successful functioning of the free market. Homophobia is not. The system could certainly accommodate demands for equal rights for homosexuals without danger to itself. But are officially sanctioned homosexual marriages and identifiably homosexual soldiers the ultimate aims of homosexual liberation? Clearly not. If by homosexual liberation we mean the liberation of homosexuals who, like most everyone else, are and will continue to be oppressed by the depredations of capital until some better way of living together can be arrived at. So then, are homosexual marriages and soldiery the ultimate, which is to say the only achievable aims of the gay rights movement? A politics not of vision, but of pragmatics. Such a politics of homosexuality is dispiriting. Like conservative thought in general, it offers very little in the way of hope and very little in the way of vision. What of all the other things gay men and lesbians have to fear? What are the things gay children have to fear, in common with all children? What of the planetary despoilment that kills us, or the financial necessity that drives some of us into unsafe, insecure, stupid, demeaning, and ill-paying jobs? Or the unemployment that impoverishes some of us, or the racism some of us face, or the rape some of us fear? What about AIDS? Is it enough to say, not our problem? Of course, gay and lesbian politics is a progressive politics. It depends on progress for the accomplishment of any of its goals. Is there any progressive politics that recognizes no connectedness, no border crossings, no solidarity, or possibility for mutual aid? Perhaps the far horizon of lesbian and gay politics is a socialism of the skin. Our task is to confront the political problematics of desire and repression. Stonewall was a 60s thing, part of the utopian project of that time. Honoring the true desire of the skin and the connection between the skin and the heart and the mind and the soul is what homosexual liberation is about. Gay rights may be attainable on however broad or limited a basis, but liberation depends on a politics that goes beyond, not an anti-politics. Our happiness as scared queer children doesn't only isolate us, it also politicizes us. It inculcates in us a desire for connection that is all the stronger because we have experienced its absence. Our suffering teaches us solidarity, or it should. When this essay was published in 1994, same-sex marriage was illegal, not just in every state in the country, but in every country in the world. 25 states in America made gay sex punishable as a felony crime. So 21 years later, on June 26th, the Supreme Court issues a 5-4 ruling in Obergefell v. Hodges, legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide, making the United States the 23rd nation in the world to do so. So what are we to make of Tony's essay today? What are we to make of it? Here's one way of looking at it. On that day, June 26, 2015, 4 people, including 2 women and a toddler, were found dead in a home in Green Acres, Florida. It was the 164th mass shooting in the United States this year. On that same day, President Obama delivered the eulogy for Reverend Clemente Pinckney, who was shot and killed along with 8 other people in his church in Charleston, South Carolina, earlier that month. Since June 26, there have been 136 more mass shootings, bringing the total to 300 this year so far, to 1,000 mass shootings in America since the Sandy Hook massacre that killed 20 children between the ages of 6 and 7. On June 26, police shot and killed 28-year-old Joe Cisneros in San Antonio, Texas. He was among the 896 people this year who have been shot and killed by police in the United States. More than half of those shot and killed have been people of color, and almost 25% of them have been African-American men. On June 26, 6 months after the president declared the end of combat operations, a US drone strike killed 6 alleged militants in Nuristan province. It was among the at least 78 drone strikes in Afghanistan this year so far, where we learned today that the US intends to keep thousands of troops through the end of 2017. If June 26 was like any other day, then over 100 million Americans ended that day below or near the poverty line. 30 million Americans were out of work or underemployed. 1 in 9 people around the world went to bed hungry that night. So yes, one way to look at it is that Tony was right. The day the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage was a day filled with as much violence and fear and want as any other day. But I don't actually think that's the point of Socialism of the Skin, and I had to read the essay many, many times to arrive at a different way of reading of it. Tony wasn't trying to paint an unchanging dystopian landscape and then take comfort in the idea that he would, in some ways, always be right. Aha, things are always miserable. He was doing the opposite. He was urging us towards what he called the unfashionably utopian. And I can't stand here today and say that we're anywhere near that utopia, socialist or otherwise. And I don't know if I will ever be able to say that. But here are a few things I do know. I know that as Tony was writing these words in 1994, a group of inconceivably brave and staggeringly young men and women were literally fighting for their lives. They called themselves ACT UP, and they used their bodies and their words and their art to disrupt the callousness and cruelty of business as usual. They stormed the NIH, they stormed the CDC, they stormed St. Patrick's Cathedral, they scattered the ashes of their loved ones on the White House lawn because that is where the blame ought to rest. They refused to be disposed of. They were beautiful. They taught themselves science and medicine and law and how to navigate the maze of arcane federal bureaucracies. And I know that because of those people, the development of drugs that saved millions and millions of people's lives around the world was accelerated. And I know that some of those people, some of those who are still alive, are still fighting. Because there are still millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa and other poor countries that need access to these life-saving drugs to survive. And they are also fighting to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement because it would bestow on giant pharmaceutical companies patents that would kill millions more around the world from diseases that are, like AIDS, entirely preventable and entirely treatable. I know that 2 days before the Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell, in what was supposed to be a closed-door photo op of LGBT leaders in the White House, another brave young woman named Geneset Gutierrez heckled President Obama. She's an undocumented trans woman, and she was raising the plight of other LGBT undocumented immigrants in ICE detention centers. And for doing this, she was shouted down by her fellow advocates and escorted out of the Oval Office. But later, her protest went public, and when it went public, it went viral. I know that so many of the leaders of the immigrant rights movement are queer, and they are coming out again. Not as lesbian or gay or trans, but as undocumented, in an attempt to weaponize their own personal stories in the mold of the gay rights movement, to assert that immigrants too have the right to form a family. I know that the success of the LGBT movement wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for women's liberation, if it weren't for the anti-war movement, if it weren't for the civil rights movement. And I know that just because we have marriage equality doesn't mean we are done fighting. As we tell the story of how gay marriage was won in so many books and movies and TV specials, I believe it is even more important that we keep telling the stories that aren't done yet, the stories that don't fit just inside one movement. I know that none of us are as alone as we think we are. None of our communities are estranged from each other as they seem to be. And I know that if your politics only makes you comfortable with your own misery, then you are doing your politics all wrong. So here's to solidarity. Here's to mutual aid and to border crossings. Here's to unexpected and unlikely connections. Here's to utopia in all its unfashionableness. And here's to being brave enough and young at heart enough to listen to those utopian longings. Enjoy the rest of this wonderful evening. Thank you.
Richard Kim. Richard Kim. You know, we did this a couple nights ago in Portland, and we had a similar sized crowd come out. They had to skip the Democratic presidential debate to be with us. In the Democratic campaign, they're actually saying, you know, it would be pretty amazing if America elected a woman as president. Yeah. And I'd say, well, you know, in Seattle, they elected the first woman mayor of a major metropolitan city in 1926. So Seattle did that a long time ago, broke those barriers. But some other people are saying, well, maybe America could elect a socialist president. And I said, well, Seattle did that a couple years ago. They elected somebody to the city council. So I pretty much figure we just come to Seattle to see what's going to happen. And we're going to have a little what's going to happen conversation now. We have two remarkable people with us who are members of your city council. Nick Licata. Came here from Cleveland, union man, organized with the steel workers, got a little bit of training. Then he decided, I'm definitely on the left. I want to go to the left coast of America. Moved to Seattle, got himself elected to the city council here, and a couple years, I know everybody talks about Seattle City Council now, but a couple years ago, I looked across the entire United States. I said, who is the most progressive member of local government in any community in the United States? We do an annual honor roll at the Nation magazine. And my selection that year, there wasn't enough competition. It was the guy who has formed Local Progress, the national group of local progressive elected officials, your own Nick Licata. And he serves on the city council with the woman who has sort of redefined what we think of local government, not just in Seattle, but nationally, Kshama Sawant. And I could do a lot of introduction, but the fact of the matter is I think we just like to say $15 an hour minimum wage. Elected to the city council as a proud socialist, saying that she wanted to raise wages for working people. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nick Licata and Kshama Sawant. Nick Licata, Kshama Sawant. At the Nation magazine, we actually interview people. And so we wanted to give you a sense of that here. And Nick, I wanted to start out with you. How'd you get political?
Well, I was a very slow learner, learning how to read. I didn't read until the 9th grade, actually until I was 9 years old. I had dyslexia. So, and the first book I read was Citizen of the Galaxy, so I might know it, the Asimov. And it was really interesting. I think I became political because I realized here's someone who's a citizen who could do something. And then my dad had a barbershop, and he would bring home these pamphlets. So the first political pamphlets I read were from the John Birch Society.
It didn't take.
So, and you know, it was this conspiracy of communists running the country, actually corporations too. So I said to myself, what is this all about? So I went out searching for the people's world I think it was like in 7th grade. And I finally found
What was world?
People's World.
People's World.
I suppose we probably don't have to explain in Seattle that was the Communist Party paper.
Communist Party newspaper. Very thin. And I finally found a bookstore in the grungiest part of downtown Cleveland. And I looked up sheepishly and I said, "Do you have the People's World?" And he said, "Yeah, it's right there." And I got it, and then I found out what communists were. And then I went to college, and I helped start Students for Democratic Society, which in Bowling Green State University, and it was due to actually a book by Tom Hayden, about participatory democracy, the Port Huron Statement. And I said, this is what it should be about. This should be what democracy is about, how we participate in it, how we have an opportunity to stop the war. At that time, Vietnam, how we basically to make sure that people basically have the right to vote and have the right to live in peace. And I then was called a communist. And so I discovered what communists were. I was one. I didn't even know that. I thought I was just in favor of a more vibrant democracy. And so through those experiences, I began to realize more and more that politics in this country is really shaped by either people who are willing to do something or people who are just passive and have things done to them. And I recognized that my family was the family that basically things were done to them. And neither of them graduated from high school. They always worked in factories and when they could. And I realized as I was getting older and went to college, I said, and I was the first ever to go to college, my relatives, I want to do something to basically help people have some control over their lives. And that's how I became political.
Nick Licata. That one worked out pretty well. Let me ask you, how about you, Kshama? How did you become political?
Well, I grew up in Mumbai, in India, and I feel that when you are confronted with a veritable ocean of poverty and misery and oppression, and I don't mean this in an Orientalist sense, because I will come to my next point about how I came to the US and experienced some of the similar things, but I feel that when you grew up in this kind of world, if you're not politicized, then you're either unconsciously or consciously repressing your political instincts, because it is only human to question why there should be so much misery when you can see that the human society has achieved pinnacles of technology and other kinds of achievement, which should mean that there shouldn't be any poverty. Why is there poverty when there is so much wealth? And of course, later on I understood the mechanics of capitalism, which really mean that inevitably under capitalism, extreme concentration of wealth mean extreme concentrations of poverty. They are not unfortunately juxtaposed towards each other. They are consequences of each other. But when I came to the US, in my naivety, I thought, okay, India is a poor country. There's a history of colonialism and imperialism. But when I come to the wealthiest country in the history of humanity, they must have figured out how to not only solve the problems of poverty and homelessness and lack of access to food, but also what I consider, coming from Mumbai, basic things like mass transit. And, sorry. And the reason Mumbai had good mass transit, there's lots of problems now because of neoliberalism, but the reason we had it was because there was very conscious, intentional investment in public services, which came about because of an influence by socialist freedom fighters at that time when we were trying to get the British Empire out. And that is exactly the kind of influence you need here. And so really for me, it was inevitable that I would not only further get politicized, but also just go towards the analysis of socialism. And so really it's an analysis of capitalism itself, where you understand that these problems that plague humanity and that really worry us, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't feel the same way as I did, really these problems are not going to be solved under capitalism, and we have to go towards a different future. As Richard said, Richard was talking about how we might sometimes reject these ideas because they seem utopian. I'll tell you something, though. It's utopian to think that these problems will be solved under capitalism and to hold on to capitalism.
In most of America, if somebody said, as you did a moment ago, you realized you were a communist, somebody said, well, you're not going to solve anything without socialism, that would pretty much be the point at which you decided not to go into electoral politics. And yet, Nick, 18 years ago, you decided to go into electoral politics. So we often have this challenge in America, the question of, the non-electoral versus electoral. What made you electoral?
Because I felt that I really believe that we're a democracy, and to make democracy real, that means that we should have the authority, the power to elect our own representatives, unfettered, with proper information. And I actually began that process in college, because I realized when I was in college, I went to Bowling Green, with a very conservative college.
In Ohio.
Ohio, Bowling Green, Ohio. And they did a poll there that showed that 75% of the people supported Nixon in 1968. Humphrey lost that election by 1%, by the way. And when literally the head of the Nazi party showed up at Bowling Green State University, 2,000 people showed up, townspeople and students, and they weren't there to protest. They sat and listened intently how he told them basically this is a country for white people. And so on that campus, I felt that I had to do something to change it, to open up people's eyes that there was something better. Two things happened, actually. One was I attended a rally of George Wallace in Toledo, and I saw the people that I grew up with in the stands, clapping and pounding and just out of their minds with supporting him. And I realized this is dangerous. And then I went to campus and had the opportunity to listen to Norman Thomas, literally a year before he died. Socialist, ran for president five times or more. He made so much sense. He was such a peaceful person. He understood the problems that this country faced. And I said, this is what I want to do. I want to reach out to the other students and try to find common bridges. And in that process, I ran as a former SDS of our chapter for student body president against a fraternity guy who is the fraternities were big, and I won. And it was amazing. I couldn't believe it myself. But I won. But I won because I was talking about, that time, student power, how we had to be able to control our environment, had to control our classes, had to control our dorms, just practical things. And so from there, when I came to Seattle, I became actually very involved in a lot of activities. There was a group called Fighting Redlining, and then did Give Peace a Dance, for some of you remember, to raise funds to stop the arms race. And as I was doing these things, I realized I want to do something that's local power. And government is power. And if you ignore it, someone else is going to run that government. So I decided I was going to run for city council with a track record of basically living in a commune for 25 years, that I still was. So I knew I wasn't going to get a lot of support from certain sectors, and I was right. The majority of the city council came out against me. Both daily newspapers did, and the mayor, and I would spend 2 to 1. So it didn't look
familiar.
It didn't. Exactly. Yes.
We'll get to that.
And yeah, and followed. So, but what I really tried to do is reach out to a lot of folks on the basic idea that government has to be responsive, has to be transparent, has to be effective, and has to be fair. Very simple concepts that would cut across the political lines and basically say, this is your government, you have to control it, because if you don't, someone else will. And that's what I basically believed in, and that's what I've been trying to practice since being on the council.
Licata. So Nick at least sort of tried to do it as a Democrat, right? You know.
Actually, I sort of consider myself a bandit.
Yeah, I realize, but on the fringe of yeah. Then you come along, and you say, no, I'm just going to put socialist alternative right out there on the sign, and get electoral, try the electoral thing, but really try it outside of what just about everybody understands as the current limits of politics. What made you decide to do it that way?
Well, there's a couple of things to this. One is, why run a grassroots campaign, an anti-corporate campaign, as an open socialist? That's one question. And I think the answer to that question is just from our analysis. Just look at, John, you mentioned the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement really brought to the fore a lot of the anger and frustration many of us were feeling on an individual level, but especially something really important about the Occupy movement was it was one of the first, in this generation, it was one of the first expressions of politicization by young people. And there was so much anger, and we know poll after poll, opinion polls are showing that American people are so fed up with corporate politics. And contrary to the ideas, peddled by the corporate media, the American public is not right-wing. The American public is very much to the left of the options that they're offered in terms of, who's in the US Congress, who's on the city council, who's in the state legislature. And so we, and when I say we, I mean Socialist Alternative, which is a nationwide organization of social and economic and environmental justice activists. We are a democratically organized organization, movement, call it what you will. And we thought that it was high time that we tested the ground, that we believed that there was a huge opening for the left to begin rebuilding itself. And not that every campaign, every left campaign in every city is going to be a carbon copy of what we did in Seattle, but I think we've been proven right in shovelfuls that young people especially are so ready, are just hungry for an alternate kind of politics. But I wanted to answer the other question, like, why did you get electoral? So I want to answer this, not because I want to talk about my personal life, but I think it's important. It contains important lessons for us going forward. How are we going to organize our politics if we are to succeed against the Wall Street juggernaut? And the way we conduct our politics in Socialist Alternative, it's not like I wake up one day and decide I'm going to run for office. And I would say Nick is one of the very few sort of exceptions to the rule who don't have a careerist viewpoint in their electoral career. Nick is genuinely doing it for what he believes in, for democracy. But for the most part, what we see is individual politicians, furthering their careers and willing to give up, make any kind of compromise that is needed for political expediency. Well, we don't do it that way, and it's a model for what we should do going forward for an alternative to the two Democrats and Republican establishments, is where we decide it makes sense to run a campaign, and then who would be the best candidate. And I have to say, just between you and me, unfortunately for me, I'm having to play this role, but everybody has to do something, and to take the movement further, and we're doing that. And the only other thing I will say is that, there is a false dichotomy between inside and outside. It's too simplistic, inside strategy versus outside strategy. The success of the $15 movement shows that you need to build a grassroots movement that genuinely incorporates the labor movement and workers themselves and students, but you need your own voice in the corridors of power, because otherwise we don't bring that voice onto the table where we can fight for our rights.
As so often happens when we do interviews, we have to cut all the good stuff out, and we're close to where we have to finish up here because we have so many other good things. But Nick, she just said she's very complimentary toward you, which is very, very nice.
He knows what I think of it.
Part of what happened there was that you were somebody who had been on the inside, and you welcomed somebody from the outside in.
Yes.
How did she do? How's she done?
I think without a doubt that, and I always call Councilmember Sawant Kshama on a first name basis. I think that Kshama's presence on the city council, I could only wish it could be duplicated across this country. Because what she brings is not only energy and passion, because people can have that, but also practical skills and organizing skills. You need to basically give something to the general public, not just something they believe, but a vision on how to get there. And on the city council, she's been very effective, even though with grumbling from some of the council members, in moving them to adopt policies they would not necessarily have adopted in the past. Although they tend to adopt more of them around electoral time. I've noticed that. And I also think that we complement each other very well because, my background is in organizing, not to the level that yours has been, but also I think the critical element is once you get in this elected office, you still have to think as an organizer. You still have to think as an activist. You still have to think about how are you going to bring people to bear pressure on other council members and yourself to move forward. And that's what she has done very successfully.
Did you have some kind of announcement you were
I
going to
do have a special announcement. I rarely endorse incumbent city council members because, as I pointed out, the majority of them oppose me and left a bad taste. And I've seen the same thing happen with Kshama. 7 of the council members came out opposed to her. I thought that was ridiculous. I mean, I think that it shows a mentality of fear, of change, and I am totally tonight and going forward, obviously, come out endorsing Kshama.
We always like to make a little news when we do interviews. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for having so little time to talk to these 2 remarkable people, but you have them in your city all the time. And before we leave, though, we also want to display the power of electoral politics. Because, Nick, what do you get to do when you're on the city council?
Among many things, but
By the way, did you vote for this resolution? Or?
Is it proclamation on, see, open it up. This is the hard part.
You don't have the power to open the thing up, but you have the...
Here we go.
All right. You don't have to read it all. But
Okay, I'll just do a quick thing rather than pass it back and forth. This is a proclamation recognition of The Nation magazine, whereas robust debate, consistent reflection, diverse voices, and nuanced perspectives help hold our institutions in accountability. And I'm just going to skip the middle part so we can, I know you're short on time here.
It's called editing.
Yes, and whereas incorporating new and archival material from some of the most reverend trailblazers and wordsmiths such as Toni Morrison, Tony Kushner, Hannah Arendt, James Baldwin, Howard Zinn, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Naomi Klein, The Nation has published its 150th anniversary issue to showcase its legacy as champion of the grassroots. Now, therefore, the Seattle City Council proclaims Thursday, October 15th, 2015, the Nation Day in Seattle.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kshama Sawant and Nick Licata, thank you so very much to both of you. My brother sitting on the tree of life in the day when Jordan roll, roll, Jordan roll, Jordan roll, Jordan roll. Oh, march the angel march, oh, march the angel march, oh, my soul, arise in heaven, Lord, for the day when Jordan roll. I want to be my Father's children. I want to be
my father's children. I want to be my father's children. Roll, Jordan, roll. Oh, say, ain't you done with the trouble on the world? Trouble on the world. I say, ain't you done with the trouble on the world? Roll, Jordan, roll. As I went down in the valley to pray, studying about that good old way, when you shall wear a starry crown, good Lord, show me the way. Oh, mourner, let's go down, let's go down, let's go down. Oh, mourner, let's go down, down in the valley to pray.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Clausel. In 1861, when the Civil War began, Union troops, in one of the first major victories in the struggle against human bondage in this country, liberated the island of Port Royal off South Carolina. African-American former slaves from the region fled to Port Royal and founded their own communities. They literally developed an infrastructure there with nothing, coming from poverty, coming from complete denial. They created on Port Royal a new African-American-led community. One of the founders of The Nation magazine, one of the first funders of The Nation magazine, James Miller McKim, was an abolitionist, a wealthy man. And in 1861, he sent his daughter Lucy to Port Royal to see what was happening there and to report back to the abolitionist community on what freed slaves were doing, how they were living. Lucy did not come back with a happy report. She wrote to her father, "How lukewarm we have been, how little we knew." She told white abolitionists they did not understand the struggle of African Americans, and they did not begin to give it sufficient support. 154 years ago, Lucy McKim said, "Black lives matter." Lucy McKim was a trained musician, and what struck her so powerfully was not merely watching people form a free community, but also hearing the songs that they had brought from Africa and from the plantations, the spirituals that they sang. She helped to gather those songs. And in 1867, The Nation magazine published Slave Songs of the United States, the first collection of spirituals taken from the African-American experience and spread across this country. The modern understanding of the spiritual as art was advanced by The Nation magazine with that publication. And Eric tonight sang from songs that were published in that book. Eric Clausel, beautiful. The Nation covers culture. The Nation covers music. For a long time, though, we did a pretty lousy job of covering sports. We knew it was important, but we didn't quite know how to do it. Luckily, we started to notice that there was this guy out there who was doing this incredible writing and radio programs and writing books and making documentaries and seizing Muhammad Ali and Jackie Robinson and all of these other figures out of just the mythology and making them into whole beings, incredible athletes, but also incredible political figures. The man who helped not just The Nation magazine, but America to see sports in a dramatically broader light. Person I am so very proud to call The Nation magazine's sportswriter, Dave Zirin.
Thank you so much, John Nichols. John Nichols, everybody, please. A lot of people don't know that John has a hobby as a big game hunter. Very shocking for The Nation. He's recently just mounted the head of Scott Walker, which is very exciting. It's such an honor to be at Town Hall, the only place I can imagine that could host an event like this, and simultaneously, down below at the other venue, it's hosting Alicia Garza from the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to recognize Ms. Garza and her amazing work as we're here tonight. It's also an honor to be in Seattle as The Nation sportswriter. I mean, to be in this amazing city where Seattle Seahawks players debate the Black Lives Matter movement in dueling press conferences. That doesn't happen in every city. Please, don't think that's normal NFL behavior. And also to be in the kind of place where teachers go on strike, not merely for higher wages, not merely to fight standardized testing, but so all children can have access to recess. Because as much as they try to make play a privilege, play is a right for every child in this world. Not just for Bill Gates' kids. We get to play too. So I'm just also so happy. One of my dear friends is here tonight, one of the teachers in Seattle. He was mentioned earlier, Jesse Hagopian. And I just wanted to recognize Jesse for his work with the strike. I had lunch with Jesse today, and I said, what was it like to be walking around Seattle wearing your strike colors while all the schools were shuttered? And he said it felt like the Mariners won the World Series and the Seahawks won the Super Bowl on the same day. It's great to be somewhere where solidarity is more than just a slogan, but it's a way that people actually live and interact. So, yes, I do write about sports for The Nation. That's not a punchline or a joke or a setup. That is my job. And it's an amazing gig. I'm the luckiest dude in the world because I get to cover issues that the corporate sports media, frankly, just does not cover. Issues like the public funding of stadiums, issues like greedy sports bosses, issues like the ripping of teams away from communities just because fans are not willing to pay billionaires for the privilege to watch. I'm sure you in Seattle have no idea what that feels like. And for me, I mean, that was a great radicalizing issue for me at the intersection of sports and politics. I went to college in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Any Twin Cities folks here by chance? Awesome, right on. And when I was in college, I would go watch the Twins at a stadium called the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome. Yes, named after a liberal hero, and yes, the most disgusting stadium you've ever seen. I mean, it was like watching a baseball game inside a large green condom. It was such a kind of gross environment that when Billy Martin was hired as manager of the Twins, he looked around and he said, Jesus, why would Hubert Humphrey's parents name him after this dump? And so the Twins needed a new stadium. As a Twins fan, I believe they needed a new stadium. But what's so shocking to me was that even though the Twins had the richest owner in Major League Baseball, Carl Pohlad, he was devoting his life to making sure that fans paid for the new stadium. And even though in 6 separate referendums, the people of Minnesota said they did not want their tax dollars going to a stadium, he still won that funding, and they did build a new billion-dollar stadium completely on the public dime. And that's why we need political sports coverage, because when it comes to sports, which is supposed to be about play and fun and community, we have to stop having socialism for the sports bosses and cutthroat capitalism for fans. We have to stop having this arena in American life where debt is socialized but profit is privatized. I'm sure that's just in sports. Yeah, it sounds familiar. And it is terrific to be here tonight with 2 city council people, in Councilwoman Sawant and in Nick, who stand with that principle that billionaires should have to pay for their own stadiums. And I'll tell you something, that's rare on city councils around this country. So that might be normalized for you, but for me, I'm just like, wow. So thank you both for standing strong on that issue. And that's how John Nichols jibes aside. That's actually how the nation has always covered sports. It's fascinating looking back at their sports coverage over the last 150 years, because the corporate sports media in the moment is wrong all the time. It's unbelievable looking back. Seriously, it's like you take the corporate sports media's brain and you put it in a hummingbird, boom, it flies backwards. They have no idea at different points in history what they're supposed to be doing. So it's like you go back in corporate sports history, it's like integration in baseball, foo-for-all, should never happened. Women playing sports, who will have babies? And that's the generalized way sports has been covered, and yet you look back at when the nation did talk about sports, granted very sparsely, it was, though, on the side of integration in baseball, on the side of Title IX and women having every right to the athletic field, on the side of not staging the 1936 Olympics in Hitler's Germany, believe it or not, something most of the sports media got wrong, and on the side of Muhammad Ali's brave stance to stand for peace instead of war in Vietnam. And that goes to the short reading I'm about to do, because it involves Muhammad Ali, and it also involves the great Victor Novatsky's wonderful theory about what the nation is supposed to be. Victor Novatsky, the former editor-publisher of The Nation, he had a theory that he said, we need to have a magazine where liberals and radicals can duke it out. And this, to me, shows that so beautifully. As former Nation editor Carey McWilliams, he wrote into the magazine on July 22nd, 1978, and his letter was called Muhammad Ali for Congress. And this is what Carey McWilliams wrote. He said, at 36, Ali's fighting career is about over, but then what will he do? He's not a man who would be content with being a celebrity. He would soon be bored with a career as a media personality. One gets the feeling that he would like to be socially useful, but not in the philanthropic route. So why not Congress? Ali is more than a celebrity. He's a man of character and charm. His stand on the draft alone stamped him as a person who has the courage of his convictions, put him down as a person of remarkable gifts, intelligence, perception, and goodwill. Well, Muhammad Ali wrote back to The Nation. Letter to the editor, 1978, one of just the many letters you see, and then there's one, it's like, oh, by Muhammad Ali, and you're like, wait, what? And this is what Ali wrote to Mr. McWilliams. He said, I'm extremely flattered by your appraisal of me. You sure have done your homework. It ain't often that I am quoted so accurately. But to get down to the nubbin, I ain't interested in politics. I mean like running for office. I'm a world man. My fellow man is not just an American, and my race is the human race. I'm shook up when I see a child that is going hungry or a mother who is out without medical attention. These are the things I'm interested in. And of course, peace. Peace for all people and all nations at all times. And I would argue that the spirit of Muhammad Ali, particularly this past week where we learn about the continuance of a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, the spirit of Muhammad Ali absolutely lives on everywhere where people fight for peace and people fight for principles that there are much better things to do with lives and resources than put them into the machinery of war. And I'm just so proud to work for a publication that lets me talk about sports like that. And now I have the absolute privilege of introducing our next speaker. She is serving her first term in the Washington State Senate. She represents one of the most racially and economically diverse districts in the state. She's the founder of Washington State's largest immigrant advocacy organization. She led the largest voter registration drive in the history of your state, and she's a contributor to numerous publications, including The Nation. I give you Pramila Jayapal.
How's everyone doing out there? So here it is. I think I'm the only state elected official here tonight, so I think that gives me the right to offer to the nation, to Katrina, Richard, and John, a lifetime subscription to Washington State and Seattle. But I can just tell you, you better buy your property now. So it's really incredible to be here tonight, and I'll tell you that listening to Nick and Kshama and thinking about my own trajectory and why I've gone from being an activist on the outside to being in Olympia is because I realized after 20 years of working for immigrant rights, for civil rights, for all the things that we care about, that instead of asking other people to do it, why don't we get in there and do it ourselves, right? Why don't we take over the system and do the organizing that we need to do on the inside and the outside? And it's been a real privilege to serve in the Washington State Senate as horrendously, I'm trying to think of a polite word, dysfunctional, how about that? Dysfunctional as it is down there. The reality is we have to reform our tax system in this state, and I'm ready to do that. And you know, we have to start funding education and our teachers, and we're getting fined $100,000 every day for every day that we don't come up with the money that it takes to fund education. And I'll tell you what, our teachers being out on the streets, and I had the great privilege to speak at the SEA strike, and it was amazing. But our teachers are doing exactly what we need you to do in the streets, building the movement and demanding change in Olympia. So my reading tonight is Eleanor Roosevelt, Fear is the Enemy. This is a letter that she wrote, or I think it was a piece that she wrote for The Nation on February 10th, 1940. When fear enters into the hearts of people, they are apt to be moved to hasty action. Here in this country today, we find people who have never sufficiently cherished their democracy to understand fully their obligations as citizens. Yet now, they are taking fright because ideas which have obtained a hold in other countries have crossed the water and are appearing in certain groups in the United States. These ideas can only appeal to those who do not really understand what democracy means, or who, for one reason or another, have had their faith shaken in the efficiency of democracy. We who believe in democracy should not be so much concerned with stamping out the activities of these few groups or individuals as with developing among the people in this country a greater sense of personal responsibility toward a democratic way of life. It is our job to know what democracy means and to try to attain real democracy. We do not move forward by curtailing people's liberty because we are afraid of what they may do or say. We move forward by assuring to all people protection in the basic liberties under a democratic form of government, and then making sure that our government serves the real needs of the people. Let us beware of unreasoning fear which will make us curtail these liberties and prevent a free expression of new ideas. Where the majority rules, there is little danger of moving too fast. When the power becomes concentrated in the hands of a few, there is great danger that the majority will not be able to move at all. So I just want to speak briefly to the context and to the person. February 10th, 1940, the interesting thing about that for me when I first saw this quote was that it was almost exactly 2 years later, on February 19th, 1942, that Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to the internment of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry. And Eleanor apparently privately spoke out against Executive Order 9066, and she defended Japanese Americans, so much so that the LA Times actually called for her to be, quote, forced to retire from public life over the issue. And Eleanor herself was kind of a groundbreaking first lady, I mean, especially for that time, but even for today. She didn't always agree with her husband, and she often said so publicly. She was beloved by African Americans, and a lot of things that I've read have said that it was really she who brought the African American voting bloc to Roosevelt. And in fact, she was reviled by many white Southerners at the time because of her support of African Americans. And she also thought and wrote deeply about fear, not just as an intellectual proposition, but because she herself felt fear a lot. And she had a great essay about this in another book. And so I just wanted to tie that back to my start in politics and this very place, actually. But after 9/11, when we were seeing the Patriot Act passed, we were seeing the detentions and deportations of Arabs and Muslims and South Asians around the country, and a group of us came together and formed what was then Hate-Free Zone, now One America. And we were right here in this building, so thank you, Town Hall. We had 1,200 people in this building. I think we broke the fire code that night. But it wasn't just the typical crowd, right? It was Arabs, Muslims, Sikhs, communities that had never participated in democracy before, actually coming out and saying, we cannot have our liberties and our rights abused in this way. And we went on to file a nationwide class action lawsuit against the government around the deportation of 5,000 Somalis across the country, and we won that. We collectively won that. So here's my reflection on fear, because it was the same aura that has permeated throughout our country, whether it's been around the Japanese internment, whether it was post 9/11, or whether it's today as we watch Bush and Trump in the presidential debates. But the first is the reality that we all do have fears. I think Eleanor actually talked about this quite eloquently in her longer essay. But the two questions really for me are that this reading made me think about is first, what causes us to go to those most fearful places? And the second is, what do we do with that fear? And so the idea in this reading that I think is so critical, that the antidote to fear is actually to make sure, this is her words, to make sure that government serves the needs of the people. Because the truth is that when government is not serving the needs of the people, when the top 1% in this country own the equivalent of 90% of all of the rest of the country, or when right here in Washington state between 2008 and 2011, all of the wealth accrued to the top 1% in our state. When that is happening, when we have our most upside-down tax system in the country right here, taking the most in taxes from those who have the least, then we create the conditions under which fear is likely to thrive. When our basic freedoms are not met, when government doesn't do its job in regulating Wall Street or preventing private prisons from profiteering on incarcerating African Americans, that's when people are most vulnerable to having their fear manipulated. And so this is where a progressive agenda that speaks to the common good, an agenda that puts the little guy or the little gal first, is so important in inoculating people against letting their fear take hold. But we also know that fear is still powerful. And so then the question is, what do you do with fear when you feel it? Does it use you, or do you use it? And I believe that it's when we feel fear deep inside of us and when we confront it, that's when courage is born. That's when the courage to change comes. That's when the courage to organize comes. That's when the courage to do the things that are necessary to do come, when you actually are able to look in yourself. And often it takes the minority speaking to the principles that unite us to push back that fear and to remind us that we're bigger than all of that. And really, that's what happened after 9/11. That's what happened when we refused to allow Arabs and Muslims to be deported and secretly detained. And that is also what happened when we here in Seattle connected in 2003 the war against Iraq to the war on immigrants. You all remember that? Were you at that march? We were one of few places that did that, to say these are deeply connected ideas. What we're doing overseas, what we're doing in other countries, the wars that we're waging in other places are creating these wars just in and of themselves. And the war on immigrants is very similar to what is happening there. So the abuses of civil liberties and civil rights right here in our own communities. What some manipulators in the top echelons of our government did is, back then, and this was really powerful for me, is to use fear and patriotism together to suppress dissent. And you saw that after the Japanese internment. I certainly saw it after 9/11. There were Sikh cab drivers walking around with their American flags, waving their American flags, not wearing their turbans, shaving their beards. I didn't dress like this for several days because there was this aura of American patriotism that somehow was going to have to override anything else that we brought as an identity, anything else that made us different. But what we in the community did was we refused to accept that narrative, and backed by publications like Yes Magazine, like The Nation, and so many people who decided that organizing on the ground was the way to fight back, we stood up, we defended our core values, and we organized for a different future. And that story, that narrative of fear, division, being defeated by the power of the people is the story of 15 in Seattle. It is the story of every movement that has ever been successful. It is the story of climate justice in Seattle. It is the story, the Battle of Seattle. That was the same story of Shell Oil. It's of people saying, no, we will not do this. So when Trump gets up there and he talks about, let's do a collective when Trump gets up there and he talks about immigrants being racist, rapists and drug traffickers, when we hear about law and order, of the silent majority, of ridding Ferguson and Baltimore of tough dudes, that's what he said, or even of criticizing Jeb Bush for speaking Spanish, and all the other sheep in the Republican presidential competition follow along, that is when we have to stand up and make our voices heard. So what gives me hope, though, is that there are three movements today that, to me, are really exemplifying the power of the people, and the power of the people to push back against fear. One is the movement for Black Lives, and it is an incredible... It is an incredible movement that is not just challenging the other side, but it's challenging us on the progressive side to make sure that we are putting racial equity at the front of our agenda, not something that we just say is nice to do but we leave behind, but that it is right front and center. The second, The second is the movement for income equality. And the fight for 15 is amazing, and it is going to continue. And you know what? I had a bill last session to raise the minimum wage to $12 across the state. They didn't want to take it. It is going to be a lot bigger when it's at the ballot. And then the third and final one I wanted to mention is the movement for climate justice, because what we are seeing in the streets and what Naomi Klein so brilliantly describes about how this is changing everything is really the issue for our next generation, but also for us today about what we do with the future. And so I wanted to end by just saying I wrote something after the Bernie Sanders rally. I think many of you probably saw it. And I wrote something about what I think we need to do, and I thought I'd end with that. In the end, if we want to win for all of us on racial, economic, and social justice issues, we need multiple sets of tactics working together. Some are disruptive tactics. Some are loving tactics. Some are truth-telling tactics. Some can only be taken on by white people, and some can only be taken on by people of color. Sometimes we need someone from the other strand to step in and hold us up, and other times we have to step out and hold them up. Each one of us has a different role to play, but we all have to hold the collective space for movement building together. It's the only way we move forward. Thank you.
Pramila Jayapal. After Bernie Sanders came to Seattle, I was interviewing him about something, and we were talking about the Seattle stop, and he said, this is going to be so tragic, my attempt here. He goes, you know, that Pramila Jayapal, she's really brilliant. She's a visionary. Got to take her on the road to all those rallies. She's an amazing woman, has done. And you see why I'm not doing imitations. Brothers and sisters, you've been so generous with your attention and your energy tonight. And I know that a part of why many of you have come to join us this evening is because you recognize that something started here in Seattle 15, 16 years ago when people went into the streets to say that all these movements come together. We can't talk about economic justice without talking about racial justice. We cannot talk about the climate without talking about war and peace. We can't separate and pull everything apart. We have to realize there are connections that have to be made. And all those years ago, this incredibly young woman from Canada, right after the Battle of Seattle, published No Logo, right around the time of it. And No Logo was this transformational book. Everybody was like, how did you know everything that we were fighting for before we went and fought for it? And it was at that point that we started to realize that Naomi Klein was always just a little bit ahead of us. When we were trying to figure out all of the horror of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, all of these things, and all the profiteering that was going on, she gave us the shock doctrine, and she explained disaster capitalism to us. And when she had given us more than any Tom Paine, then she said it was time to get to work. I was at the People's Climate March yesterday here in Seattle, marching with Naomi Klein and saying, as she says, when we come together in solidarity, recognizing the connections of all these movements, this changes everything. What changes everything is the power of the people united. What changes everything is Naomi Klein.
Such a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you all for being here to celebrate the nation. which is very much my home as a writer. And I'm just so grateful to all of my colleagues at The Nation, but I want to thank in particular Katrina Vanden, who is our fearless leader. We're so proud of Katrina, you know, who is not only this brilliant writer and thinker, but has this ability to go on television with these assholes and stay completely calm and say amazingly radical and lucid things, and we all just cheer. So we love you, Katrina. And I also just want to give a special shout out to Richard Kim, who is my editor at The Nation. He is, as you saw, an utterly brilliant writer, and he is an equally brilliant editor, and it is such a privilege to work with him. So I am reading a piece by the great Wendell Berry. It's called The Unsettling of America. You may know his book by the same title, and it appeared in the Nation on June 4th, 1976, and I want to repeat that date, June 4th, 1976, because it is such a prescient essay. And you know, if we cast our minds back to what was going on and what he was reflecting on, specifically, it was the energy crisis. But this was still early days. It was years before Jimmy Carter would tell Americans they had to put on a sweater. So here is Wendell in 1976. One possibility is just to tag along with the fantasists in government and industry who would have us believe that we can pursue our ideals of affluence, comfort, mobility, and leisure indefinitely. This curious faith is predicated on the notion that we will soon develop unlimited new sources of energy: domestic oil fields, shale oil, gasified coal, nuclear energy, solar energy, and so on. This is fantastical because the basic cause of the energy crisis is not scarcity. It is moral ignorance and weakness of character. We don't know how to use energy or what to use it for, and we cannot restrain ourselves. Our time is characterized as much by abuse and waste of human energy as it is by the abuse and waste of fossil fuel energy. Nuclear power is presumably now going to be used benignly by the same mentality that has egregiously devalued and misapplied manpower. If we had an unlimited supply of solar or wind power, we would use that destructively too, for the same reasons. Perhaps those sources of energy are going to be developed. Perhaps all of them can sooner or later be developed without threatening survival, but not all of them together can guarantee survival, and they cannot define what is desirable. We will not find those answers in Washington or in the laboratories of oil companies. In order to find them, we will have to look closer to ourselves. I believe that they are to be found in our history, in its until now subordinate tendency of settlement, of domestic permanence. It is to be found in the ambitions of thousands of immigrants. It is formulated eloquently in some of the letters of Thomas Jefferson. It was the dream of liberated slaves. It was written into law in the Homestead Act of 1862. There are few of us whose families have not at some time been moved to see its vision and to attempt to enact its possibility. I am talking about the idea that as many as possible should share in the ownership of the land and thus be bound to it by economic interest, by the investment of love and work, by family loyalty, by memory and tradition. How much land should this be is a question, and it varies with geography. The Homestead Act said 160 acres. The freedmen of the 1860s hoped for 40. We know that, particularly in other countries, families have lived decently on far fewer acres than that. This old ideal is full of promise. It is potent with healing and with health. It has the power to turn each person away from the big-time promising and planning of the government and to confront in himself, in the immediacy of his own circumstances and whereabouts, the question of what methods and what ways are best. It proposes an economy of necessities rather than an economy based upon anxiety, fantasy, luxury, and idle wishing. It proposes the independent, freestanding citizenry that Jefferson thought to be the surest safeguard of democratic liberty. Perhaps most important of all, it proposes an agriculture based on intensive work, local energies, care, and intentional permanence. That is, to state the matter from a consumer's point of view, a dependable long-term food supply. This is a possibility that is obviously imperiled by antipathy in high places, by adverse fashions and attitudes in the general public, by the deterioration of our present farm communities and traditions, by the flawed education and the inexperience of our young people, and yet it alone can promise us the continuity of attention and devotion without which the human life of the earth is impossible. It's such an honor for me to read that beautiful piece by Wendell Berry, who is one of my personal heroes as well as one of my teachers in the journey that I've been on and that produced This Changes Everything. When I first embarked on that journey, I felt kind of insecure. You know, as John said, I cut my teeth writing about consumerism and marketing and then later economics and trade, labor rights, human rights, but I was a city girl. And I felt really insecure writing about nature. I understood that climate change was really important, it being an existential threat and all. I just wasn't sure that I was equipped to write about nature. And so one of the first things I did is go on a kind of a pilgrimage to interview Wendell Berry. It's one of the first things I did. And that brought me to Salina, Kansas, of all places, where Wendell was giving a lecture at a place called the Land Institute. Some of you may know it. It was founded by Wes Jackson, an incredible scientist, farmer. And the Land Institute, which is also a place that Wendell has long ties to, it's devoted to the project of transforming our entire approach to agriculture so that it does a much better job of mimicking what actual living ecologies look like and function like. So rather than monocrops replanted year after year at tremendous cost to the soil, what they try to do at the Land Institute is, first of all, develop systems of polycropping, but also they have this amazing groundbreaking program devoted to breeding perennial food grains. So wheat, sorghum, barley, that doesn't need to be replanted year after year and functions more like the native prairie grasses. So what happens with perennial grasses is that they have these incredibly long and deep roots. And these roots are capable of storing water and therefore withstanding drought. So it's very important, not just in terms of caring for the soil, but also in the context of climate change and the kinds of droughts that we're seeing. These roots hold soil in place, and that's important in the face of storms, which is also relevant to climate change. And they also do a much better job of sequestering carbon, which is a actual climate solution. And one of the things they do at the Land Institute is they dig up a few of these root systems of the their perennial crops so that you can actually see them. And this is kind of amazing because usually this is all happening, under the earth, so you can't see it. And these root systems, some of them reach 10 feet down, and they are these intricate webs of strong branches, like underground trees, actually. And, when you compare them with these wimpy little wispy root systems that hold up so much of our agricultural plants, it's really quite dramatic. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm going on and on about roots. So they had one of these amazing dug-up perennial root systems hanging behind Wendell Berry while he was speaking in this barn in Kansas. And Wendell delivered his lecture, and much like the piece that I just read, it was about the importance of settling down, of putting down roots, and then defending your home place against all those who would do it wrong. Wendell doesn't believe in NIMBYism. He says, my job is to love and defend my home place, and your job is to love and defend your home place, and if we all did that, we would just be fine. And this is what Wendell has done in his home place in Kentucky, practicing a kind of agriculture that is not based on the extractive logic of taking and then replacing with chemical inputs, but rather protecting those sacred cycles of fertility that are a part of the natural world and augmenting them. And it's also what he does with literature in telling the stories of his home place. And it's also what he does as an activist, standing up and getting arrested, taking on the coal barons who blast the tops off of mountains in his part of the world. So I vividly remember watching Wendell in that barn, this incredibly rooted man who knew exactly where his home was, with this backdrop of this intense root system. And I have never felt like such a fraud. And I just sat there going, I cannot do this. I'm just so hopelessly urban and rootless. I'm this wandering Jew. My ancestors have moved from place to place, fleeing pogroms and conflicts and the Vietnam War. That's how I became Canadian. And then they started fleeing winter and just kind of, you wouldn't know anything about that here, right? And then just out of habit, I realized that I had come to think of home as a sort of a commodity. And, you think about those lists that rank Seattle as in the top 5 places to live in the world or in the United States, as if where we live is, nothing more than a hot new restaurant, So at the same time I was having this feeling of intense fraudulence, I also had this feeling that this was somehow relevant to the problem of climate change, to our failure to rise to this challenge. Because though climate change is a global phenomenon, though our Earth as a whole is warming, the way it plays out is intensely local. It plays out in intensely local geographies, an early blooming of a particular flower, an unusually thin layer of ice on a lake, the late arrival of a migratory bird. This is in the early stages. And noticing these kinds of subtle changes requires an intimate connection to a specific ecosystem. You have to know a place to know that it isn't actually normal to be able to wear a t-shirt in mid-October. It didn't used to be like that. There used to be winter, for instance. And that kind of communion only happens when we know a place deeply, not just as scenery, but also as sustenance, and when local knowledge is passed on with a sense of sacred trust from one generation to the next. But that is increasingly rare. Many of us abandon our homes lightly for a new job, a new school, a new love, and that more knowledge is lost. And then there's climate change, which is busily adding to the ranks of the rootless every day as natural disasters and failed crops and starving livestock and wars displace more and more people from their ancestral homes. And with every human migration, more of that site-specific knowledge is lost. So after the lecture, I had my interview with Wendell, and I very tentatively asked him whether he had any advice for rootless people like me and my friends who live in our computers and always seem to be shopping for home. And what Wendell said was this. He said, stop somewhere and begin the 1,000-year-long process of knowing that place. Now, I think that's really good advice. And the good news, I think, is that a lot of more people are finding their home place and deciding to stop, even if they're relatively new to that. And I've been thinking about that returning to the Pacific Northwest. It has been a year since I was in Seattle. And this is such a powerful phenomenon in this part of the world that some of you call Cascadia, and more of you are calling Blockadia. This part of the world has clocked more victories against the fossil fuel giants than I think any other. Just a few months ago, we all saw the birth of a new word, the kayaktivist. Taking on Shell's rigs headed for the Arctic, right here in Seattle, as well as Bellingham and Portland, and that amazing, unforgettable image of your kayaks, your beautiful, colorful kayaks surrounding that monstrosity. And I think it may have had a little something to do with Shell's decision to pull out of the Arctic for the foreseeable future. So thank you for that. And this was not an isolated victory. This region has successfully taken on tar sands pipelines, canceled multiple coal export terminals. You're fighting coal trains and oil trains. Seattle was the first major city to join the fossil fuel divestment movement when 350 kicked it off a few years ago, and that idea has spread. Now Paris has caught up to you. So you're leading Paris. Now you just have to get Bill Gates. Can you get Bill Gates? We want your billions, Bill. We are after them. The next challenge is to make Seattle what many are calling a fossil-free city. And what that means is no new fossil fuel infrastructure. No new fossil fuel infrastructure. No new train lines, no new pipelines, no new storage facilities, no new export terminals. And this is critical because there's a massive push on now to lift the export ban on oil. We have to fight that, but there is a bullseye on this region. They're going to want to be using it as yet another fossil fuel export terminal. We are counting on you to stop it because we do have to build things. We have to build all kinds of things. But we need to build the infrastructure of the future. And that's the other part of Wendell's essay that's so powerful, I think, is that it was an early call for climate justice, right? When he says it's not just about switching to wind and solar, because if we don't change the logic, we'll do that in an unjust way. We'll do that in a way that is utterly unsustainable. He saw that and he knew that, and it was such an honor to be part of a genuine climate justice march here in Seattle, where all of those issues were integrated, where people were fighting not just for renewable energy, but for energy democracy, to own and control that renewable energy, and for frontline communities to be first in line to benefit from energy democracy as we transition off fossil fuels, not just green jobs, but green jobs that pay a living wage, that are unionized. And at the same time, climate justice means as we contract the extractive economy, we need to expand the caring economy. Climate workers are not just the people who are putting up solar panels and wind turbines. Low carbon workers are people who care for our kids and teach our kids and care for the sick, the sectors that are under relentless attack, which is why the logic of austerity is utterly incompatible with life on Earth. We need to expand the caring professions. And I need to say, I know I'm running out of time, that climate justice also means that, yeah, we need a price on carbon, but it matters how we do it. It has to, there's talk in the state right now about a revenue-neutral carbon tax. That's crazy. That's crazy. You need the revenue. You need the revenue, but you have to collect it in a just way, which means low-income people get back more in credits. But the people who can afford it have to pay higher rates, and most importantly, the polluters need to pay for this transition. Polluters, my dear friend Bill McKibben was arrested today at a gas station in Burlington, Vermont, because he was so beside himself with rage at the revelations that have come out over the past 3 weeks about the fact that Exxon, since the 1970s, has been conducting cutting-edge research about climate change off of its tankers and suppressing that research, and not just suppressing the research, but funding the climate change deniers and making us lose decades. And we are paying that price in our acidified oceans. People are paying that price in the loss of their island nations. Exxon needs to pay for this transition. We need to make that happen. Sometimes when I say that climate change changes everything, people say, Naomi, it was already big enough. Did you have to make it about capitalism? Listen. Wendell has this wonderful quote that I use a lot about this idea that, it's too big. Are we really going to win? Can we win? He says this. He says, we don't have a right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have a right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live in it? I think this is particularly true when it comes to climate work. The decision of whether or not to maintain hope in the face of an existential crisis should not have anything to do with mathematical odds. The stakes are so high that if there is any chance of avoiding catastrophe, it is our profound moral responsibility to do everything we can to increase those odds. And that's what being part of the nation family and the nation tradition means to me. It's a family and a collective history that I deeply cherish. It's as close to a home as a wanderer like me is ever going to get. We don't fight because we know we're going to win. We fight because it's right and just, and because we know that we cannot afford to lose. Thank you.
Naomi Klein. When you hear someone like Naomi speak, or Dave, or Richard, or any of these other folks, it is easy to focus on them and to recognize their genius. It is harder sometimes to recognize how difficult it is to pull all of that together and to keep it together. To do that in a magazine, you need an editor who is willing to subsume her own genius, sometimes even her own passion, to create a sense of community, to create a sense of place where everyone else can shine. It is a remarkable skill, and it is a remarkable talent. And I have seen it in play now for 20 years. When I said I wanted to come to Seattle in the spring of 1999 to cover what were going to be protests in the fall, and no one else in national media was paying attention, Katrina Vanden Heuvel said, go to Seattle, go do it, cover the hell out of it. And she sent a team of other people to come as well. Today, President Obama announced that what we feared would be endless war in Afghanistan would indeed be endless war. That the United States would stay in a war launched under George Bush, pursued under Barack Obama, through the next presidency. And I wrote about Barbara Lee. And I wrote about Barbara Lee as the one person who said in 2001 that you can't vote for an authorization of use of force in Afghanistan or any place else, an endless war on terror, because it will become a blank check for every president to remain at war for year after year after year after year. And when Barbara Lee cast that vote, she was not a hero. She was not treated well. She had to have security in the days after that vote. But one editor said, we need to publish an interview with Barbara Lee and make sure that people know exactly what she's thinking and exactly why she is saying it. The Nation magazine published Barbara Lee in the first issue after 9/11. That is a visionary journalism, and that is the journalism of Katrina Vanden, the editor who authorized that story, and our host tonight. Please welcome to this stage, Katrina Vanden.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Seattle, for opening your hearts, your spirits, your minds to the nation tonight. You want to know why the nation has survived and thrived for 150 years? You just met the reasons. You listened to them tonight. Fearless writers, thinkers, doers. Naomi Klein, I can now just hang it up after those words from Naomi Klein. Thank you. But Richard Kim, John Nichols, Dave Zirin, Pramila, Kshama, Nick, honorary members of the Nation family. Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to say thank you again to Naomi. It is true, I go on TV and tussle with assholes. But tomorrow night, I am going to be on television, maybe with a lone asshole, but Bernie Sanders is leading the show. And somewhere in there, I take hope that we will hear from, he's now my second favorite socialist. We will hear from a socialist on corporate television, and then I'll go tussle with some more assholes. But let me just be serious and let me be brief, because you have given us your attention. How could you not, listening to some of these beautiful words? But there is a reason the nation has survived. I'd say one of the main reasons is a ferocious independence, a refusal to live in a country of downsized politics with excluded alternatives, to lift up voices like Barbara Lee's, like those of this city's, of the states, who speak out against a wall, often a wall. And we stay true to our first principles. There's a history also that we bring to bear. I think of that arc of history that becomes our compass. You heard Martin Luther King Jr. was our civil rights correspondent from 1961 to 1966. He summoned the country to economic justice, racial justice. He first came out against the war in Vietnam 2 months before his famous Riverside Church at a Nation event in Los Angeles, an event like this. James Baldwin wrote a piece in 1966, Report from Occupied Territory, Harlem. We could publish it today, change a few commas, about policing abuses in cities in this country, about the abuses of stop and frisk. We've published Hunter Thompson. Hunter Thompson wrote his first piece about what led to Hell's Angels. We've published E.P. Thompson, the great British historian. Howard Zinn. The indomitable Molly Ivins gave us humor. Tony Kushner. Toni Morrison. And Ralph Nader he wrote his first piece for The Nation in 1959, which became The Unsafe Car You Can't Buy, but launched the consumer rights movement. And in that tradition, you heard tonight Naomi Klein. She's changed everything. And someone who we nurtured, Jeremy Scahill, has an extraordinary report out today on the abuse of drones. But someone like Jeremy Scahill is what The Nation is about. you never read stories about war in the same way, and you know that when you hear this country is restrained and you have a president who has bombed or droned 7 countries, and we have 135 special operations around this globe, that is not restraint. It is time to wage peace, not war. Just want to say, picking up on what Pramila said so beautifully, hours after the horrific attacks of 9/11, just a couple miles from the nation offices, we refuse to capitulate to fear. It is not popular to go against government policy in times of war, but by the way, this should never have been a time of war. We lifted up Barbara Lee. We lifted up those who said it is not a time for vengeance, it is a time for a just response. And as this country headed into the Iraq War, we unwaveringly opposed it, understanding how destructive it would be. Notice how many people now say, oh yeah, I was opposed to the Iraq War. They were out there, and liberals, just like this. We understood because we had a DNA which understood that military action would lead to this region aflame, more terrorism. Military intervention is not a response to barbarity and injustice abroad. I think the Iran agreement is one we must fight for, and not to put a damper on this evening, but we are probably as close to war as we have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis right now. And I think anyone who calls for a no-fly zone in Syria is calling for a proxy war we don't want. We need diplomatic resolution of that crisis. But let me close by saying, one of what John said, and thank you, John, I'm a steward of a great tradition. As Naomi spoke of, a family, a collective in so many ways. I wake up every morning believing another world is possible. I also wake up some mornings with despair. But you can't despair, you gotta keep moving. And this is a remarkable moment. It is a movement moment. It is a movement moment which gives hope. And it's a time when what seemed unthinkable is playing out in real time. The rules are being rewritten around this country, around the globe, not always in pretty ways, but they are being rewritten. We are in the fight of our lives. Thanks to have the people in this city you just heard from tonight on the front lines, understanding that we are in the fight of our lives when it comes to climate, when it comes to corporate power. But we have organized people. We have people at our back. We have the wind. And we will refuse to see the hijacking of our democracy by oligarchical money, by the architects of reaction and bigotry. And you can hear in this great space tonight the possibility of that fight, and it's going to be real. But we at the nation have been in fights before. We've been in good times in this country, not so good times. The height of McCarthyism, our printer wouldn't publish us. The Nation was published in Alabama by the publisher of Southern Farmer because he was a great friend of Carrie McWilliams, the then editor. Fear has stalked this land before, as Pramila and Eleanor Roosevelt understood, but we do not capitulate to fear because a great nation is not built on bigotry, fear, and hatred as that passel of fools, which at best looks like the Star Wars scene at the bar, travels this nation. Let me finish by saying we are cultivating a new generation of writers and thinkers. We launched a new website on our actual birthday, July 6, 1865, because we want to bring our journalism to a new generation. 1 million people read us every week on different platforms, and that makes me proud, even though, as John said, it might have been 1/4 when we made a profit. So let me close. The nation's journalism has sustained, oxygenated, inspired movements and their allies inside and outside. For 150 years, we stand shoulder to shoulder with women, with migrants, with climate warriors, fast food workers, car washeros, with labor, LGBTQ activists, teachers, nurses, prisoners, the poor. We understand, as Elizabeth Warren said in her recent remarkable talk about Black Lives Matter, channeling the civil rights hero John Lewis, sometimes It is important to cause necessary trouble. The nation was founded by those committed to causing some trouble, necessary trouble, to fulfilling a more perfect union, to redeeming the promise of our democracy. That is our fight, and you are our allies in that fight, and the promise of this 150th tour is so realized tonight. When we sit here with you, we get away from our desks, those screens, and we are actually hearing you in this hall, and you are listening to us, and to be in Seattle is extraordinary, so thank you. I want to bring John Nichols up to close this a wonderful evening. Thank you, thank you.
Brothers and sisters, you've given us more than we have given you. After we marched in Seattle in 1999, and I will thank you, because the last time I was here, it smelled more of tear gas. But after we marched in Seattle in 1999, we tried to figure out what to say, what would our slogan be, because we didn't read Naomi well enough. We wanted to have a logo. We wanted to have a slogan. And a lot of people struggled for it, and they came up with this phrase, "Another world is possible." When I walked the streets of Seattle over the last couple days, when I marched with the climate marchers, when I saw LGBT and Q communities, when I saw activists, anti-war activists, social justice activists, when I saw Kshama and her campaigners out there, I realized that it was exactly appropriate that that phrase, "another world is possible," would come out of Seattle, because brothers and sisters, you are showing us the next world that is possible. You are doing it here, and we have come to lift it up and take it to the rest of the nation and the rest of the world. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Please welcome back to the stage. Please welcome back to our stage Dave Zirin. Please welcome back to our stage Naomi Klein, Richard Kim, Kshama Sawant, Nick Licata. Let us thank our wonderful production crew tonight, Kevin Joyce and Martha Ensign. And if Jessica Lynn Diamond, come on up here, the woman who organized all these events, please welcome an actual organizer for the nation, Jessica Lynn Diamond. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, the man who gave us song, Eric Clausel. Please welcome Eric back up to our stage. Come on, Eric. Thank you, Seattle. Another world is possible.